October 18, 2026. 9:47 p.m. Dolby Live at Park MGM, Las Vegas. More than 20,000 fans stood shoulder to shoulder beneath thousands of dazzling lights, singing every word as Bruno Mars smiled through the final chorus of his biggest hit. But just as he raised his microphone for the last note, the sound disappeared completely. Not a crackle, not a burst of feedback, just silence. Bruno stared at the microphone, tapped it gently against his palm, then looked toward the sound booth with a confused expression. The band instinctively stopped playing. The audience laughed at first, assuming it was a harmless technical glitch, but then Bruno noticed something strange. Every technician backstage was frantically talking into their headsets, yet nobody seemed to be looking at the broken microphone. Instead, every pair of eyes was fixed on someone standing near the stage entrance. A young woman dressed in a plain gray hoodie stood perfectly still, holding a weathered white envelope against her chest. She wasn't waving. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't trying to get Bruno's attention like everyone else. She simply stood there, staring at him with tears quietly rolling down her face. Bruno's smile slowly faded. Something about her expression felt painfully familiar, although he couldn't understand why. His longtime tour manager, Marcus, rushed onto the stage, leaned close, and whispered something into Bruno's ear. Bruno's face instantly changed. His shoulders stiffened, his breathing slowed, and for the first time that evening, he looked genuinely shaken. "Are you sure?" Bruno whispered. Marcus nodded once. Bruno looked back toward the young woman, then at the silent microphone still resting in his hand. Without saying a single word, he placed it gently on the stage floor. 20,000 people suddenly realized this wasn't an ordinary equipment failure. A heavy silence settled across the arena as thousands of glowing phone screens remained frozen in the darkness. Bruno slowly walked to the edge of the stage and spoke without amplification, his natural voice barely reaching the first few rows. "Give me just a minute," he said softly. Nobody understood what was happening. Why had Marcus looked so worried? Who was the mysterious young woman? And why did Bruno suddenly seem like he had forgotten he was standing in front of a sold-out crowd? Earlier that same evening, everything had felt perfect. The Las Vegas residency had broken attendance records for the month. Fans had traveled from more than 30 countries, and backstage the atmosphere had been full of laughter. Bruno had spent nearly an hour joking with the band, taking selfies with crew members, and thanking every stagehand by name before the concert began. Everyone noticed he seemed unusually grateful that night, as if he wanted to appreciate every small moment. During rehearsal that afternoon, he had even surprised the janitorial staff by bringing them pizza and sitting with them during their break instead of hiding inside his dressing room. "Nobody makes this show happen alone," he had said with his usual smile. The workers laughed, thinking he was simply being kind, but one elderly janitor named Walter quietly replied, "Never forget the people behind the lights." Bruno smiled at the time, never imagining those words would echo through his mind only hours later. Now, standing before thousands of silent fans, Bruno stepped down from the stage and walked directly toward the young woman in the gray hoodie. Security instinctively moved to stop her, but Bruno gently raised his hand. "It's okay," he said. The audience watched every movement on the giant screens overhead. Nobody could hear their conversation, but everyone could see the envelope trembling in her hands. She hesitated before finally offering it to him. Bruno accepted it carefully. The envelope looked old, its edges yellowed with age as though it had been carried for years. Written across the front in faded blue ink were only 4 words. "For Bruno, when you're ready." Bruno stared at the handwriting. His heartbeat seemed to stop. He recognized it immediately. He hadn't seen those letters in almost 20 years. His fingers trembled as he slowly looked back at the young woman. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. She swallowed hard before answering. "My father asked me to give it to you, if I ever had the chance." Bruno blinked several times, struggling to process what he had just heard. "Your father," she nodded. "He said you'd remember him." Bruno searched her face, hoping another memory would surface, but nothing came except a strange ache in his chest. "What's your father's name?" The young woman took a shaky breath. "Daniel." Bruno whispered the name to himself. "Daniel." The sound alone unlocked fragments of forgotten memories that rushed into his mind like flashes of old film. A tiny rehearsal room in Honolulu. 2 teenagers laughing while writing songs nobody would ever hear. Cheap guitars, empty pockets, impossible dreams. Then suddenly, nothing. The memories stopped as quickly as they had appeared. Bruno looked completely overwhelmed. Marcus gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe you should go backstage," he suggested. Bruno looked toward the crowd. Thousands of people remained unbelievably quiet. Not one person demanded another song. Not one person booed. Instead, they simply waited. Bruno turned back toward the audience. "I'm sorry," he said honestly. "Something unexpected just happened." His voice cracked slightly. "Can you give me a few minutes?" The crowd answered with warm applause instead of disappointment. Some fans even shouted words of encouragement. Bruno smiled weakly before disappearing backstage with Marcus and the young woman. Inside the quiet hallway behind the stage, the excitement of the concert vanished completely. Crew members stepped aside respectfully as Bruno slowly opened the envelope. Inside rested a single handwritten letter and an old faded photograph. The picture showed two skinny teenagers sitting on a rooftop with borrowed guitars, laughing so hard neither could look at the camera. Bruno stared at the photograph for several seconds before quietly covering his mouth. "I can't believe this," he whispered. Marcus glanced at the picture. "That's you." Bruno nodded. "And Daniel." The young woman smiled through her tears. "My dad kept that picture beside his bed every day." Bruno carefully unfolded the letter. The paper was worn from years of being opened and closed. He immediately recognized Daniel's handwriting. "Dear Bruno, if you're reading this, then life finally brought our paths together again, even if I couldn't make the trip myself. First of all, don't blame yourself. You never left me behind. Life simply carried us in different directions." Bruno stopped reading. His eyes filled with tears almost instantly. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes for a long moment before continuing. "I always believed you'd become exactly who you are today. I used to tell everyone that one day the whole world would sing your songs. They laughed at me. I never did." Bruno couldn't continue. His breathing became uneven. Marcus quietly looked away to give him privacy while the young woman stood silently, watching the man her father had spoken about her entire life. After nearly a minute, Bruno finally asked, "Where's your dad now?" The young woman's lips quivered. She looked down at the floor before answering in barely more than a whisper. "He's at St. Rose Hospital." Bruno's eyes widened. "Is he sick?" She slowly nodded. "The doctors don't think he'll make it through the weekend." Silence filled the hallway. Somewhere beyond the walls, 20,000 fans still waited inside the arena, without knowing the real reason the concert had stopped. Bruno looked once more at the letter in his hands, then toward the stage entrance where the audience patiently remained, and for the first time in his career, he realized that finishing the final song no longer felt like the most important thing he had to do that night. Bruno remained motionless for several long seconds, the letter still trembling in his hands as every sound around him seemed to fade into the distance, until he finally looked at Marcus and quietly said, "Tell the band I'm not coming back out." "Not yet." Marcus hesitated because in all the years they had worked together, Bruno had never walked away from an audience before the final song. But one look into Bruno's eyes told him this was different. "I'll handle it," Marcus replied before hurrying toward the stage. Moments later, the giant screens lit up with Marcus standing before the microphone, explaining that Bruno had experienced an unexpected personal emergency and asking everyone for patience. Instead of frustration, the arena answered with applause, and thousands of phone flashlights slowly illuminated the darkness like a sea of tiny stars waiting for someone they deeply respected. Backstage, Bruno turned toward the young woman. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I don't even know your name." She managed a small smile despite the tears still resting in her eyes. "Emily." Bruno nodded. "Emily. Your dad never told me he had a daughter." "He always wanted to," she answered. "But after you became famous, he felt like your life had become too big to interrupt." Bruno shook his head immediately. "No, that's not true." Emily carefully reached into her backpack and pulled out a small, worn notebook wrapped with a faded blue ribbon. "He wanted you to have this too." Bruno accepted it with both hands. The cover was cracked from years of use. When he opened the first page, he froze again. Every page was filled with handwritten song ideas, unfinished lyrics, little drawings of guitars, and dozens of dates stretching back almost 20 years. Tucked inside one page was a faded receipt from a tiny diner in Honolulu where Bruno and Daniel used to spend hours talking about music because they could only afford one meal between them. Bruno smiled through tears as another memory rushed back. He remembered Daniel pushing the plate toward him and saying, "You eat. Someday you'll buy me dinner when you're famous." Bruno had laughed, promising he would buy the entire restaurant instead. They were just kids chasing impossible dreams. Neither of them imagined life would separate them so completely. "What happened?" Bruno finally asked. Emily took a slow breath. "After you moved away, Dad stayed in Hawaii. Grandma got sick, so he worked 2 jobs to take care of her. Then Mom got sick too. Music became something he only played at night after everyone else was asleep." Bruno lowered his head. "Why didn't he ever call me?" Emily looked at him kindly. Because every time your songs came on the radio, he'd smile and say, "Bruno made it. That's enough for me." Those words struck Bruno harder than he expected. Fame suddenly felt painfully small compared to the friendship he had unknowingly lost. He looked around the backstage hallway where dozens of crew members were pretending to stay busy while quietly listening. No one interrupted. Even the stagehands who usually rushed from one task to another stood perfectly still. Bruno closed the notebook and slipped Daniel's letter safely back inside. "Take me to him," he whispered. Marcus returned just as Bruno finished speaking. "The audience is still waiting," he said. "No one's leaving." Bruno looked toward the arena doors, hearing the faint sound of thousands of fans softly chanting his name. He swallowed hard before making a decision that surprised everyone. "Let's go to the hospital." Marcus blinked. "Right now." Bruno nodded without hesitation. "Right now." Within minutes, an SUV quietly exited the loading dock behind the arena. News hadn't spread yet. Most people outside still believed the concert had been paused because of a technical problem. Bruno sat silently in the back seat beside Emily, staring through the window as the bright lights of the Las Vegas Strip reflected across the glass. After several minutes, he finally spoke. "Tell me about your dad." Emily smiled faintly. "He still played guitar every Friday night." Bruno looked over. "Really?" She nodded. "At a small senior center. Mostly old country songs, Elvis, a little jazz, and sometimes your songs." Bruno couldn't help smiling. "He played my songs? Every week." She laughed quietly. "He'd always tell everyone, 'I knew that kid before the world did.'" Bruno looked down at the notebook resting on his lap. "I wish I'd known." Emily reached into her bag again and handed him an old photograph. It showed Daniel sitting beside a hospital bed with an acoustic guitar. Several children surrounded him wearing colorful hospital gowns, all smiling while singing together. "He volunteered every Saturday," she explained, "even after he got sick." Bruno stared at the picture for a long time. Daniel looked thinner than he remembered. His hair touched with gray, but the smile was exactly the same. The same smile that had encouraged him years earlier when every record label rejected their demo tapes. The same smile that always believed tomorrow would be better than today. "He never stopped believing in people," Bruno whispered. Emily wiped another tear from her cheek. "He said music only matters if it helps someone feel less alone." Bruno leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes. Those words echoed through his mind over and over until the SUV finally turned into the quiet entrance of St. Rose Hospital. It was almost 10:40 p.m. The emergency entrance glowed beneath bright white lights while ambulances quietly rested outside. As soon as Bruno stepped out of the vehicle, a cool desert breeze swept across the parking lot. Everything felt strangely peaceful compared to the roaring arena they had left behind less than an hour earlier. Inside the hospital, a nurse immediately recognized him, but instead of asking for a photo, she simply smiled gently and pointed toward the elevators. "Room 614, she whispered. "He's awake." Bruno thanked her and stepped inside the elevator with Emily and Marcus. Nobody spoke during the slow ride upward. Bruno could hear only the soft hum of the elevator motor and the sound of his own heartbeat. When the doors opened onto the 6th floor, the hallway was nearly silent except for distant monitors beeping steadily behind closed doors. Emily stopped outside room 614. She looked at Bruno with nervous eyes. "He doesn't know I found you." Bruno nodded slowly. "Then let's surprise him." Emily carefully pushed open the door. Inside, Daniel lay resting beneath a thin white blanket. His face looked older than Bruno remembered, and illness had stolen much of his strength. But as soon as he heard the door open, he slowly turned his head toward them. At first he only saw Emily. Then his eyes moved past her. They landed on Bruno. Time seemed to stop. Daniel stared without blinking, convinced he was dreaming. Bruno smiled through tears and quietly said the same words he hadn't spoken in nearly 2 decades. "Hey, Danny. You still owe me dinner." Daniel's eyes instantly filled with tears. A weak laugh escaped his lips before emotion overwhelmed him completely. He reached out a trembling hand, and Bruno crossed the room in seconds, taking it firmly in both of his own. Neither man spoke for several moments. They simply looked at each other, letting 20 years of silence disappear without needing explanations. Finally Daniel whispered, "You actually came." Bruno squeezed his friend's hand a little tighter. "I should have come a long time ago." Daniel smiled gently. "No. You came exactly when you were supposed to." Outside the hospital room, Marcus quietly stepped into the hallway after noticing his phone vibrating nonstop. Hundreds of messages from the concert crew filled the screen. Then one text from the arena manager caught his attention. The audience is still here. Almost every single person refused to leave. They're waiting for Bruno. Marcus slowly looked back through the small window in Daniel's hospital room, realizing the night was becoming something no one in Las Vegas would ever forget. Marcus quietly slipped his phone back into his pocket without saying a word. Through the small window in the hospital room, he watched Bruno pull a chair beside Daniel's bed as if no time had passed at all. The years between them slowly disappeared. Emily sat near the window, silently wiping away tears while giving the two old friends the space they needed. Daniel smiled weakly. "You still tap your fingers when you're nervous," he said. Bruno laughed softly and looked down at his hands. "And you still notice everything." Daniel nodded. Some things never change. For the next several minutes, they talked about the simplest memories instead of the painful ones. They laughed about sleeping on studio floors because they couldn't afford hotels. They remembered borrowing guitars that were missing strings. They joked about the tiny restaurant where they once split one cheeseburger because it was all they could afford. Every story brought another smile, another laugh, another reminder that before fame, awards, and sold-out arenas, there had simply been two young dreamers who loved music. Finally, Daniel's smile faded slightly. "There's something I've never told you," he said quietly. Bruno leaned closer. "What is it?" Daniel took a slow breath. "The last record label that rejected us. They called me after you left." Bruno looked confused. "They did." Daniel nodded. "They wanted to sign only one of us." Bruno stared at him in disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me?" Daniel smiled gently. "Because they said you had something special, and they wanted you without me. I knew if I told you, you'd refuse the deal." Bruno's eyes filled with tears. "You're right. I would've." Daniel squeezed his hand. "Exactly. And I couldn't let that happen. One of us had to make it." Bruno shook his head, unable to speak. Every success he had celebrated suddenly carried a hidden sacrifice he had never known existed. Daniel continued softly. "Watching you succeed became one of the greatest joys of my life. Every award you won felt like we won it together." Bruno lowered his head as tears rolled freely down his face. "I spent years wondering why you disappeared." Daniel smiled. "I never disappeared. I was cheering for you from home." The room fell silent except for the gentle rhythm of the heart monitor. Even Marcus standing outside had to wipe his eyes. Emily looked at her father with quiet pride. "He never missed one of your concerts online," she whispered. "Even when he was too sick to sit up, we'd watch together." Bruno looked toward her, overwhelmed. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Emily smiled sadly. "Dad always said, if fate wants us to meet again, it will happen naturally." Daniel chuckled weakly. "Looks like fate had to break your microphone to get your attention." Bruno laughed through his tears. "Best equipment failure of my life." Everyone in the room laughed together, the tension briefly giving way to warmth. Then Bruno reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the worn notebook Daniel had kept for nearly 20 years. "Let's finish one," he said. Daniel looked puzzled. "Finish what?" Bruno opened to an unfinished song written in faded pencil. Half the lyrics were complete. The chorus stopped in the middle of a sentence. "We never finished this one." Daniel smiled as recognition filled his eyes. "I forgot all about that song." "I didn't," Bruno replied. "I just forgot where I left it." Bruno quietly asked a nurse if he could borrow a guitar from the hospital's recreation room. 20 minutes later, an old acoustic guitar arrived. It wasn't perfectly tuned, and its body showed years of scratches. But Bruno smiled the moment he held it. He gently strummed the opening chords while Daniel softly whispered the missing lyrics from memory. Emily watched in amazement as the unfinished song her father had carried for decades finally came to life. Nurses stopped outside the room. Doctors quietly gathered in the hallway. Patients whose doors were open listened in complete silence. Nobody recorded the moment. Nobody wanted to interrupt it. The music wasn't perfect, but somehow that made it even more beautiful. When the final chord faded, Daniel closed his eyes with a peaceful smile. "That's exactly how I imagined it," he whispered. Bruno leaned forward. "We're recording that song together when you get stronger." Daniel looked at him with grateful eyes but said nothing. Somehow they both understood that promise wasn't really about a recording. It was about hope. Just then Marcus's phone rang again. This time he answered. After listening for a few moments, he stepped quietly into the room. "Bruno." Bruno looked up. "Yeah." Marcus smiled through watery eyes. "The arena is still full." Bruno blinked. "Still? Not one encore. Not one complaint. They've been waiting for almost 2 hours." Bruno looked at Daniel. Daniel smiled. "You should go back." Bruno immediately shook his head. "I'm staying here." Daniel squeezed his hand one last time. Go finish your concert, then come back. Those people waited because they love your music. Don't let them go home wondering if you're okay. Bruno hesitated. Emily nodded gently. We'll be here. After a long silence, Bruno stood and hugged his old friend carefully. Neither of them said goodbye. They simply smiled at each other, both understanding that some friendships never need dramatic words. 40 minutes later, Bruno walked back onto the stage inside Dolby Live. The moment the audience saw him, more than 20,000 people rose to their feet. The applause continued for nearly 5 full minutes. Bruno stood quietly at center stage, unable to speak at first. Finally, he looked across the sea of faces and smiled. Tonight my microphone didn't fail, he said softly. Life reminded me that sometimes the most important songs happen after the music stops. The arena became completely silent. Bruno told them about reconnecting with an old friend without revealing every personal detail. He spoke about gratitude, forgiveness, and never waiting too long to tell people they matter. By the time he finished, countless fans were wiping away tears. Then Bruno picked up an acoustic guitar. I'd like to sing one last song, he said. It's one the world has never heard before. He began playing the unfinished song he and Daniel had completed only an hour earlier. The melody floated gently through the arena as thousands of lights swayed together. Many people cried without fully understanding why. They simply felt the honesty behind every word. When the final note faded, nobody screamed. Nobody rushed for the exits. Instead, 20,000 people stood in complete silence before slowly applauding with tears in their eyes. Months later, after Daniel had peacefully recovered enough to leave the hospital and continue treatment closer to home, Bruno invited him onto the stage during another Las Vegas show. This time, they finished the song together before a standing ovation that seemed to last forever. Bruno later named the piece When You're Ready, honoring the words written on the weathered envelope that had changed everything. Fans would remember the night as the concert where the final song was canceled, but Bruno remembered it differently. To him, it was the night he discovered that the greatest performance of his life had never happened under the spotlight. It had happened in a quiet hospital room, beside an old friend who reminded him that the strongest voices are often heard when the microphones fall silent. And from that night forward, every time Bruno walked onto a stage, he carried Daniel's notebook in his dressing room as a simple reminder that success means very little unless you never forget the people who believed in your song before the rest of the world ever heard it. The story didn't end when the arena lights dimmed that night. In many ways, that was where it truly began. Over the following weeks, Bruno found himself thinking less about ticket sales, streaming numbers, and award shows, and more about the handwritten notebook that now traveled everywhere with him. Every page reminded him that dreams are rarely built by one person alone. Before every concert, instead of heading straight to the stage, he would quietly sit alone in his dressing room for 5 minutes, open Daniel's notebook to a random page, and read a few lines of unfinished lyrics. Sometimes they were funny, sometimes they made no sense at all. But every single page reminded him of a friendship that had survived 2 decades of silence. Daniel's health slowly improved beyond what many doctors had expected. The treatments remained difficult, and there were good days and bad days. But something inside him had changed after seeing Bruno again. The nurses often joked that he smiled more than anyone else on the floor. Emily noticed it too. Every morning her father reached for his guitar before reaching for his phone. Music still works better than medicine, he would laugh. One afternoon, Bruno arrived at Daniel's house in Hawaii without cameras, reporters, or security. He carried nothing except 2 acoustic guitars and a paper bag filled with cheeseburgers from a local diner. Daniel opened the door, stared for a second, and burst into laughter. You finally bought dinner, he joked. Bruno laughed right back. Only took me 20 years. They spent the entire afternoon on the porch overlooking the ocean, playing songs they had written as teenagers, forgetting lyrics, laughing at old mistakes, and watching the sun slowly disappear beneath the horizon. There was no audience, no spotlight, and no applause. Just 2 lifelong friends enjoying the kind of moment money could never buy. Before Bruno left, he carefully placed Daniel's old notebook back into his hands. Daniel looked surprised. I thought you wanted to keep it. Bruno smiled. I don't need the notebook anymore. Daniel frowned slightly. Why not? Bruno placed a hand over his heart. Because everything that matters is already in here. Daniel nodded quietly, understanding exactly what he meant. Months later, during the final night of Bruno's Las Vegas residency, he stepped onto the stage and looked across another sold-out crowd. Before singing a single note, he smiled and said, Life has a funny way of interrupting our plans. Sometimes the interruption becomes the greatest gift you'll ever receive. So if there's someone you've been meaning to call, someone you've been meaning to forgive, or someone you've been meaning to thank, don't wait for a broken microphone to remind you. The audience answered with warm applause before thousands of phone lights filled the arena once again.